Welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast, where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Mike.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. Today's episode, we're going to explore a topic that sits at the intersection of data, decision-making, and responsibility, data equity. Now, we talk a lot on this show about how to visualize data well, how to communicate it clearly, but behind every chart, every metric, every story, are decisions, sometimes tiny ones, that shape who is represented, how they're represented, and what conclusions we draw. And to help us navigate this important terrain, I am joined by Heather Krause, founder of We All Count, and a longtime quantitative researcher. Now, Heather has spent her career uncovering the hidden assumptions embedded in data work and helping organizations think more critically, transparently, and equitably about the choices that they make. Heather, it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Mike. I am so excited to be here and get a chance to have a conversation with you. Thank you for the invitation.
For our listeners who may be new to you and to your work, how would you describe what you do and what We All Count is all about?
Yeah. So We All Count has a very narrow swim lane. We have a very specific purpose. We help people build data projects that align with their priorities, their communities, and their purposes. And our bottom line method for doing that is to help people break through this really damaging myth that as long as a quantitative data project is done according to some static recipe, it's value neutral, in quotes. And that's an extremely damaging myth that costs money and costs lives. So we help people work through that and find tools that allow them to build data projects that are accurate, rigorous, and that are aligned with their equity goals.
So the equity goals that you're talking about, this data equity, what do you mean when you're talking about data equity here?
Essentially, it isn't actually possible to create quantitative data or conduct a quantitative analysis or design a quantitative visualization that is value neutral. And I know that this comes as a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people. But instead of wasting time and money and valuable resources trying to pursue something that isn't possible, what we do around data equity is to help people open their eyes to the process of evidence generation that is actually happening. A data project is a series of choices. And each one of those choices prioritizes a certain lived experience or prioritizes a certain set of assumptions. Every time we make one of those choices, we are either aligning with the purpose and priorities of the project that we're working on, or we're moving that project farther away. And the mathematical consequences of that are what numbers come out. And the human consequences of that are who gets to see their lived experience as evidence.
So this doesn't necessarily come solely from the source of a data set that has been acquired. It can come from, let's say, the process by which you decide to collect this data if you are doing surveys or if you are designing an experiment. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, absolutely. There are hundreds of choices all along the evidence generation path, and the ones you're talking about happen in the data collection phase. There are choices in the data collection phase ranging from who are we going to collect data from to what methodology are we going to use to collect data. They also include things like who is going to be the enumerator if it's an in-person survey. That's something that often goes wildly overlooked and has a demonstrably measurable impact on the responses that you're going to get to human surveys. We work with something called the data equity framework that helps people, because this can be overwhelming. And in order to kind of reduce overwhelm, and make something that's concrete and practical and can be used in the real world in 15 minutes, we use something called the data equity framework, which helps you find your way through a data project. What are the different steps that are involved in your data project, from resource allocation to scoping your data project's purpose, to project design, of course, what methodology you're going to use, what question are you answering, to what we're talking about here, data acquisition, and then, of course, to what a lot of your listeners are interested in, the analysis, and then the data interpretation, visualization, and communication. All 7 of those steps involve a very specific set of choices. Most of us, in the name of quote unquote value neutrality, have been taught to suppress those choices as much as possible so we can present this nice looking piece of evidence that we can pretend is value neutral. And that's bad for science, and it's bad for people.
This is something that, you're right, we have been trained to think of. If it's objective data, like if it is numeric data, let's say, that we just accept, well, this is a measurement, or this was a reading from a sensor, or this was something that you can't argue it because it is a fact. To your point, there are decisions all along the lifespan of that numeric piece of data becoming a fact that could have been made differently. And I was curious to know, are there any of these like little subtle decision points that you could point out to us along the way?
Yeah, exactly as you're saying, Mike. There's this idea that the reason we use quantitative data and quantitative analysis is because it's objective. The bad news is that's not true. And the good news is that's not true. We can, by learning these new sets of competencies, produce the best possible science. I really want to emphasize that I am not in any way trying to say that we should dumb down or soften up science. Quite the opposite. I'm saying we are not paying enough attention to the best practices and some specific ideas of the choices that you're asking about. For example, when you say, well, this data is value neutral, it's coming from a sensor. Say it's a wearable, a health sensor that's going to monitor the different health metrics that are coming off of a human being. The choice of what sensor to use is going to create a very different data set because there's, of course, lots and lots of evidence of, depending on the color of your skin, depending on other sociobiologic characteristics of individuals, different sensors are going to work or not work or be more or less accurate. So immediately, although you have a very high-tech sensor attached to people, the accuracy of the data in that data set is going to be better or worse for different types of people. And it's impossible to avoid that. My probably favorite example is the choice of what denominator we're going to use. Denominators are the bottom half of fractions. If we eat half a pizza, that's 1/2. The 2 is the denominator. And denominators are incredibly powerful in the data visualization and data storytelling world. They are often chosen almost entirely by habit, and they are very powerful and effective ways to perpetuate and embed the current power dynamics. So if we have a tiny little school that has 3 classrooms in it. One classroom has 3 students in it. One classroom has 6 students in it. One classroom has 9 students in it. If I ask a room of 500 people, what is the average classroom size in this school? Almost everybody will immediately say 6. And that is accurate and that is correct. But that's doing the math by embedding, prioritizing the lived experience of the teachers in the school. If we want to know what the average classroom size in that school is from the lived experience of the students in those classrooms, the answer is actually 7. And we can talk more about the math of that if you want, but essentially, it's so habitual that people would just automatically do math in a way that centers who we think is the most powerful person in this scenario, which, if you've gone to conventional education in North America, is usually the teacher in the classroom. And so we just do the math that prioritizes that, and we claim that to be value neutral. And I want to clarify that I'm not saying that data equity is using the denominator of students instead of the teacher. I'm saying that data equity is noticing that a choice is getting made and selecting the option that is best aligned with your purpose. 6 and 7 are very close together, but that's because I used an example that we could do in our heads.
Mhm.
If we had an actual 40 classroom school or a school district, those numbers are going to be very far apart, and they're really going to matter. And so if you're looking at those numbers to try and decide what school to put your kid in, you need to know which denominator was used. Are you going to get an answer that's actually going to tell you what the experience of your child is going to be? Or are you getting an answer that's going to tell you what the experience of your child's teacher is going to be? Which is an important answer if you're trying to, say, allocate teachers through a teachers union. So neither of those denominators are the correct or the more equitable denominator. But importantly, neither of those denominators are value neutral.
I think what I'm hearing is that data equity is not picking one or the other. It's realizing that there is a choice to be made and figuring out then, as you said, what choice is aligning with the goals of the project that you were trying to take on.
Yeah, the specific question that you're trying to answer. That absolutely is my working definition of data equity, is realizing that these choices exist, whether we believe in them or not. Sometimes I'll get a colleague that'll say, oh, Heather, this is cute. This is nice what you're doing. But I'm a real scientist, and I'm not going to dumb down or soften up my science. I'm going to make the objective scientific decision. And then I sit down with them and I actually carry little dolls around with me to do this exact example. And I'm like, okay, so how are you going to take an average classroom size without selecting a denominator? You have to select a denominator. And there's no such thing as the simple scientific objective denominator. Data equity is about realizing that these choices are getting made and then paying attention to what are the options here and which option is actually going to give me an accurate, useful answer. So that's why I said it's not bad news. It's really good news that all of these choices exist.
One of the things I was thinking about is that people would have misconceptions about what the term actually means. And clearly, I'm among those people who had some misconceptions about what the term means. Have you found that there are other assumptions that people make when you bring up this concept, that it is, like you said, somebody says, this isn't really science-based. And you're like,
Sure.
That's all well and good, but I'm trying to bring rigor to my investigation. But it sounds like what you are trying to do is bring additional rigor to the table.
Absolutely. Trying to do better science, do more rigorous and more transparent science. Absolutely. There's numerous misconceptions depending on where I am in the world talking about it. The biggest one is, I would say, that whatever equity issue the person that I'm speaking to cares about or is angry about, if they're not a big fan, is what I'm saying. So in other words, if I'm in parts of the United States, there's a big assumption that I mean doing quantitative projects in a way that is designed to reduce racism. Or if I'm doing stuff in Canada, it's usually anti-colonial stuff. So making sure that the Indigenous way of knowing is getting centered. And all those are kind of case-by-case examples of how you can use data equity tools to promote the values or communities that you're interested in. But data equity is not about anybody outside you telling you that this has to be anti-racist, this has to be anti-colonial, this has to be pro-disability rights or anything else. There's so many different equity issues in the world that it's much more about making sure that you aren't accidentally harming the people that you are trying to make meaning with.
And as we bring up these different categories, I suppose, they're challenging for all of us. Anybody who works with this kind of data on a regular basis, it feels fraught in so many ways when we try and make sure we're treating everything fairly. Is there a specific way that you recommend people think about grouping or disaggregating those sorts of categories, like race, income, gender, anything that might raise people's hackles in the way that you end up grouping people together?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that's absolutely one of the most common misconceptions is, an equity project definitely collects this social identity data and definitely disaggregates by this social identity data, whether it's gender, race, tribe, disability status, immigration status. And that's a big misconception because, as you say, those categories are very fraught, and working with data that sorts humans into boxes is fraught and should be fraught. I don't actually think it's nearly fraught enough. I think that is, in terms of what I recommend practitioners think about, that's the first thing I recommend before you start worrying about, how you're going to sort people into different bar charts, or should they get different colors, or what order should they be in your dashboard. Before any of that, it's really important to think about the responsibility that you are taking on when you decide to amplify or collect data that sorts human beings into boxes. I don't think people are scared or worried enough about the impacts of that. It is an extraordinarily powerful thing that we do without often being able to explain why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and who got to make these decisions. So that's what I recommend if you are going to either collect or use data that has any kind of social identity, demographic information, that you make very, very sure that you understand what that data is measuring, what categories were made available through the collection of that data, whether it's self-identification or indirect identification or some AI bot deciding, and that you understand what categories are available. You understand what mechanism was used to sort people, because lots of times it's not an equitable or empowering method of sorting people into boxes. And then finally, who got to make those decisions? And so after spending time with those questions and making sure that you can answer that, then we recommend thinking about what's the purpose? Why would you include this data in your data viz or in your dashboard? Who stands to benefit from it? Who's exposed to risk from it? And not assume that you have to do it for equity. You have some great examples in your book about this. I really liked your example about people looking for second jobs. And you kind of illustrated literally how breaking people who were looking for second jobs, which I know isn't an identity category, but it functions in the same way in this case, when they broke out every possible kind of flavor of looking for a second job, it broke apart a group of people who actually had a fundamental similarity that was important to amplify in that data viz. The same thing happens when we use identity categories out of habit. We break apart people and emphasize their differences rather than emphasizing their similarities, which is not always right and it's not always wrong, but has to be done with a tremendous amount of attentiveness to who is this good for, who is this bad for.
For me, there's an aspect of, you follow not necessarily best practice, but known practice. If I'm looking to figure out, how would I collect data and include demographic? Well, the census tells me that I should break it down by these categories. Well, if this is the biggest version of this, then, I should follow their example and I should just do this as my default. And instead, it sounds like the opposite is true. They should start by not putting boxes and think instead about which boxes, if any, are actually necessary for what we're trying to do. And it better be worth it, because then you are treating people less as individuals and more as an amorphous group.
Yeah. And the census is a great example, because the census is designed to serve a nation state. The purpose, people get very upset that there aren't, 100 different race or ethnicity categories in the American census. And of course, I empathize with that, and I understand emotionally why that is. And yet it's very congruent with the purpose of the census. The purpose of the census is not to get a nuanced understanding of the identity of the people that live in various jurisdictions. The census is designed to help a nation state make efficient and strategic decisions about its resources. And that is sometimes great, and that is sometimes very horrible. And so before saying, the census is doing it this way, we should do it this way, it's quite the opposite. We're working right now with a housing planner. So this is a corporation. This is not a business that has a lot of, it's not a nonprofit where its number one goal is equity. It's not against equity, but it's not its primary business imperative. And so when they're working on housing, the census data isn't useful to them at all. Because, for example, knowing whether a family or a household is Asian, whether their federal administration category is Asian in the jurisdiction where they're working is completely unhelpful, right? A Bangladeshi experience compared to a Japanese experience, compared to Hong Kong experience is going to be entirely different when it comes to housing, and the services that they need from this company are different. And so they're not in any way aligning themselves with the census. But at the same time, when the census, the federal government is, I don't know if it still is in the United States, but when it used to do housing planning, they might have needed those broad categories for national level policy. Using a federal nation state's manner of collecting demographic data as a best practice for understanding communities is a very bad habit. But I should say, sometimes it's necessary, right? If the priority of your project is to, for example, get federal funding, and you want to have enough food to give to the food insecure people that you are supporting through this grant, and this grant requires you to collect race data aligned with the U.S. Census, then collecting race data aligned with the U.S. Census probably is in alignment with your project's priorities. You just have to remember that's what you're collecting. You're collecting federal administrative category data. You are not collecting self-identity. Nobody's internal sense of self is reflected in a national census.
I think there's something important that you did just mention, and that you were working with a private sector organization, that this is not something that is limited to nonprofits or other governmental organizations. Given that you are working with all of these different organizations, including private sector, that implies that there is a business case for data equity, because they would not be doing this otherwise. So could you explain what the business case for data equity might be?
Yeah, sure. There absolutely is. I mean, I guess I always want to define terms. And so business case is a word that I would want to be very careful with, because businesses have very different intentions and mandates. But what I can say is that some of the private sector companies and institutions that we work with are the most committed to data equity, because they have some very serious accountability, right? Like, they have dollars and cents on their dashboards and they're going to get fired if it's not right. So the way that data equity can align with goals or outcomes that aren't just necessarily we successfully amplified the needs of such and such a community is that when you pay attention to the choices that are present in your evidence generation process, the number one effect is that your evidence generation process gets more efficient. You are required to pay attention to how data is coming in, how data is coming out, what these definitions actually mean, what we're actually measuring in various parts of data. And at first, people look at paying attention to all the choices, whether they're social sector, public sector, private sector, and think, oh my gosh, like, no boss, no senior leader, no funder is going to give us all the time we need to do this. And I'm like, that's actually the opposite. This is going to make your work go so much faster once you do just a little bit of front end work, building a foundation. And so efficiency, and I never expected that, to be quite honest. It never was a goal of mine or even an idea, but we have seen that over and over and over in companies. And accuracy. If you say, what is your average classroom size? And you don't realize that there are at least two answers to that question. And you don't have a process in place for clarifying which answer you actually need, you are probably losing money. And losing money is something that the average private sector business really doesn't like. We work, interestingly and very unexpectedly, quite a lot in the automotive sector and in the oil and gas sector. And this very same choice of denominator came up when this was a couple of years back, when electric vehicles were new and people were ordering them and they were waiting for them to get delivered. And that company they did the calculation prioritizing the lived experience of their dealers rather than prioritizing the lived experience of their consumers. Long story short, this works just like the classroom size example. They accidentally left consumers waiting in very long lines because they had distributed the inventory that they did have in a very inefficient way, because everybody just looks at this, take an average, and they just take an average. And so they lost a ton of money until we realized what was going on and we fixed it.
It's so interesting to me.
Yeah.
In the storytelling with data parlance, this is consider your audience first. And this is essentially what we're talking about here, which is picking the denominator is, to your point, picking the people for whom this is going to matter. When you are actually addressing a problem, whose problem is it? Or who are we trying to solve the problem for, I guess, is also another way of saying that. I think we make choices sometimes based on what would be easier to figure out, or what's cleaner to do the math on, or what feels like it'll take less time, or what's close enough. But you literally said that you can take 15 minutes and apply this framework or think through it. And if 15 minutes at the outset is something that will save you plenty of time later on and makes the stuff more accurate, it seems like all you have to do is convince people of it once or demonstrate it once and then get more buy-in. But I suppose it's getting to that first time through that can be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, for sure. The biggest barrier is conventional data education. People are absolutely trained very, very carefully. Here is the list of static recipes that you are supposed to follow in order to achieve rigor, in order to achieve objectivity, in order to achieve unbiasedness, which is a word with a very different mathematical meaning than a kind of street meaning.
Sure.
Unbiased. If I could get rid of one word, the data analysis sector, it would be unbiasedness, because it is accidentally used as a weapon, and it doesn't really help. I mean, I think this might change with the introduction of AI, but it doesn't really help that being a data practitioner, being a quantitative professional has a lot of status around it. And so it sets us up for having a group of professionals that have a lot to lose if they need to go back and say, we're going to change the way that we do this. I mean, this is how I came to this, was making some horrible mistakes in public. I didn't just sit around and think this up. There were some horrible mistakes that I made in public that harmed people so badly that I realized, oh yeah, there's a huge gap in the way that data practitioners are being educated, and that it's not enough just to learn some static recipes and turn the crank, just fire up your R engine or your Tableau engine or whatever and to press go. That is how we harm people, by accident. Really smart, really well-intentioned people who have definitely been taught that the way to protect themselves and others is to try and remove everything human from a calculation. And that's not possible. Pretending that it is and trying to achieve a certain appearance of rigor by pretending that it is has gotten us to a very bad situation. That isn't that hard to fix. I want to circle back to what you were doing there. You don't have to go back to school and get your PhD. You don't have to find a hilltop and go and meditate for 100 years. And you don't have to redo every single aspect. We highly recommend that you spend 15 minutes and you notice one choice in your dashboard, one choice in your chart, and just reward yourself for noticing that choice. I used to use little jars of M&Ms. Just you get an M&M every time you notice a choice. And that is often enough of a spark that helps people see this as a good thing, that then they're off and running.
So you are saying that to start applying this framework, the things that you do, the decisions are so discrete that you could literally reward yourself for making one of these decisions.
Not even for making, just for, you got to start by just noticing.
Okay.
That part can't be skipped over, because noticing the decisions is the part that has been plastered over in conventional data science professional education. Again, not because people are bad. This isn't like some giant conspiracy or anything. It's just what was economically feasible and rational at the time. If you're sitting down to make a dashboard, like right now we're working with a computer science company that has an HR dashboard. They're really working hard to retain their employees. And they're doing initiatives and they need to see if those initiatives are working. I was literally sitting beside this colleague saying, okay, what do you notice? And of course, because we had talked about it, what denominator am I choosing? She noticed that right away. She doesn't have to change the dashboard. She doesn't have to, she just gets the M&M. She noticed it. And then a real good one that she was teaching me about was she noticed that she was about to add a reference line. And she had a habit of adding a reference line in a specific way. She said that I think that is actually the choice I want to pay attention to. That's the choice I want to focus my current skill building and professional competence growing around, especially if I just stick with the defaults that my IT team gave me. No shade to IT teams, but they haven't usually had any ethics or equity education because we think IT, that has nothing to do with equity. No, that's actually where the infrastructure of equity gets built. And so she's just getting an M&M right now every time she notices that she's about to add a reference line. And then she stops, she considers the options, she thinks about which option is actually going to tell the story that they are trying to tell.
So one person in an organization that's noticing these things and making choices or being aware that there are choices, is that enough to have an impact, or is this something that you then have to, I know ideally you would expand it to a broader team, but is there a minimum level? Can it be one person or does it have to be more than that?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely can be one person because, again, we are talking about nitty-gritty concrete choices. And these nitty-gritty concrete choices have huge mathematical and human effects that rip. And, which department is seen as doing well or doing not well in this employee retention initiative is going to depend on which reference line that one person puts in. Now, would it be lovely if every person who was making a dashboard in her company was also paying attention to these defaults are not actually what we want to know? How much money is our company losing because we're just clicking this default? And how many employees are we losing? And how many employees is our competition who's decided to think about this default and just make one small change in the back end of the dashboard? One person is plenty, and a team is great, and a company is fantastic. But I think that this feeling that it's too much, I can't get people on board, is an important barrier to mentally get past.
So given that every project is different and everybody's goal is different, is there a way that you could say, here is a first step, or here is a specific thing, or here's a question you can ask yourself if you are that one person and you want to start applying data equity principles or start applying this framework? Is there something that you could point to and say, at least start doing this?
Yeah, I would think that it kind of depends on what your day-to-day job is and also what your learning style is. I think one option of just do this is every time that you are about to start on a data project, whether it's an analysis, collecting survey data, or building a dashboard, making a viz, I would select one choice that you're going to pay attention. Again, pay attention to. You don't have to do it differently yet. And I know that for certain personalities, that's incredibly frustrating, but sustainable success is the goal here. And then the second thing I would recommend that we have found to be very effective is when you find yourself in conversation about a decision. So when you're going to decide, we're going to use these colors to make it more accessible, or we're going to put the heading on the top left because that's the way that eyes scan, or we're going to reduce the visual clutter, I say in quotes, to make this chart more efficient. I love that word, more efficient. The one thing to do is to simply add the phrase "for who" on the end of every single one of those sentences. This is going to get more efficient for who, because the data viz choices that are very effective and resonant for one group of people are unreadable for another group of people. I know that's, again, what I like about your book. Your book is the book that talks about the "it depends" jar, which I love. I kind of adopted that. One of the reasons that I worry about data practitioners and data viz is that there's this temptation to avoid feeling uncertainty within yourself as a practitioner by referring to a list of rules, by referring to a list of guidelines. And those list of rules and those list of guidelines have their places. They're a really good starting place. They're a very bad ending up place. And they are definitely not going to be your equity goals, your community goals, the lived experiences that you're trying to prioritize.
Mm-hmm. If we want to learn more about it, people could take data equity training, which I know is something that you offer in various levels of intensity and time. I'm curious if you hear back from people who have taken it with feedback on specific ways that it has affected their clients' work or their own work or their perspective on life.
Yeah. So I think the number one piece of feedback that we get is that working with We All Count provides them with the words or the examples to be able to express what they already felt and knew. And that makes me really happy, because a lot of people go into the data practice world either as collectors, analysts, visualizers, because they do genuinely want to understand what's going on and help others understand what the heck is going on. And lots of times there is this tension or this feeling of, something isn't quite right, especially as you reach a certain level of maturity or depth in your practice. And it's very hard to describe what isn't right when you don't have the words and you don't have any examples. And when you start talking about it, the quote unquote scientists or guardians of rigor around you are like, this is not soft qualitative data. This is quantitative data. It's hard. It's objective. And so that's the number one feedback that we get is thank you for helping us find a language that we can use both to create better data projects for ourselves and have more useful conversations with our clients or with our bosses. When people ask a data visualizer to produce a chart or produce a dashboard, they hardly ever provide enough actual clarity for what they need in order for that data visualizer to do a really good job. But if you already know going in the 5 or 6 choices that you're going to have to make as the data visual professional, you can hand that to them in paper or in a conversation or in an intake interview and have a conversation that means that they're going to be more satisfied with your work. You're going to be more satisfied with your work, and your work is going to be more accurate and more useful and more equitable. And you're probably not going to harm the people that you are trying to make meaning for, whether that's a racial community, whether that's an employee community, whether that's a disability community, whether that's an entire country of people.
Whatever we might have thought, you had an idea of what data equity was. You had some idea of what it was at the top of this conversation.
Yeah.
But for those of us participating and listening, I think we have a very different idea of what it is versus what we might have thought it was going into it. It is much more about being accurate, as you said, being efficient with the work that we do, almost more reminding ourselves that the data that we are using on a regular basis is all representative of a human experience in one way or another. And oftentimes I think what we are doing with this data is trying to affect people's lives for the better, ideally. And this is a way that we can be more confident and more satisfied in our ability to achieve this. So before we go, I just want to make sure that people who do want to find out about how to start applying this sort of framework or learn more about it, how can they find out more about you, about your work, and about data equity in general?
Absolutely. If you've made it this far in the conversation, we would very much like to talk to you. So weallcount.com is the digital home of all things data equity. You can find ways to register for courses. And as Mike said, we offer lots of different levels and intensity of public-facing courses. We also do private trainings for teams and companies. And we also have a data equity community forum. That's not a membership site. Anybody can join and share resources, ask for help. There's hundreds of people from lots of sectors and lots of different countries. So you can always drop in there. There's a link from weallcount.com. And I think the thing that I would most like to invite people to, which is my favorite thing we do, is on Fridays, We All Count does something called Talking Data Equity, which is informal, casual, drop-in, no pre-registration required, no cost to attend, where we get into the details and like kind of masks off, share what's working, what's not working, who has a solution for this problem, who has a solution for that problem. Sometimes it's technical. We've had some great data visualizers come and talk to us about the work that they're doing. And sometimes people come to share their projects. And you can always find out who's on every Friday at weallcount.com.
Excellent. I will make sure that we have all of those links included in our show notes to make it easy for people to find. Heather Krause, big thank you to you for sharing your insights and experiences, helping me understand that data equity is not just an abstract idea, but something that is actually very much directly connected to our everyday work and the real consequences that work can have.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. It's been a delight to be able to have this conversation. And thank you for all the outstanding work that you do. I love your podcast, love your book.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for listening. And we will talk to you next time.